Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third segment in our Planning Your Irish Impact webinar series. Today, we're going to talk about how you can maximize your philanthropic impact with a donor-advised fund at Notre Dame. Throughout this afternoon's discussion, we'll cover a variety of topics related to donor-advised funds, including what they are, how they work, and the benefits that a donor-advised fund offers for benefactors, the university, and other charities that Notre Dame's benefactors support. Now, I am joined today by TJ Polari, Senior Director for Gift Planning Advancement. TJ has been with the university for 6 years, serving as a resource for alumni, parents, and friends who would like to explore the different charitable planning opportunities here at Notre Dame. Welcome, TJ.
Thanks for being here, Leanne. It's great to see everybody again. We're grateful to have another chance to dig into a topic that's been, I would say, more and more relevant to Notre Dame's benefactors over recent years. You mentioned we're going to cover a wide range of topics related to donor-advised funds today, and so it's important that we start at the outset to share that it's always important for folks to know that this is not, of course, legal or tax advice for any individual circumstance, and that anytime we're talking about philanthropy, certainly philanthropy with tax ramifications, that individuals consult with their own legal and tax counsel before they move forward with a gift. But with that disclaimer aside, I'm eager to jump right in.
Right, so let's start with the basics. First, tell us what a donor-advised fund is and how it works.
Yeah, so at the highest level, a donor-advised fund is really just think of it as a charitable giving bank account or a charitable giving investment account. And there are really three key features that make donor-advised funds unique. The first is that when you make a contribution into a donor-advised fund, that is considered a completed gift for tax purposes. But the uniqueness of the fund is that you don't have to make decisions right away about where that money goes. You can retain the flexibility to decide when and where ultimately to make those what we call grants from a donor-advised fund to charities. And in the meantime, those dollars are sitting, again, in an investment account that has the power to grow over time tax-free. So it's a dynamic tool that presents a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, sounds like a great opportunity. And it feels like you're hearing more and more about these donor-advised funds. Do you find that they're growing in popularity in terms of a way for people to execute their philanthropy?
Yeah, for sure. So if you look, Leanne, at the last maybe 10, 15 years, you'll see nationwide an explosion in use of donor-advised funds. If we look at some of the data around this, so if we look at 2011 to 2020, that 10-year period, new donor-advised funds have increased in that period by nearly 21% per year. The value of grants or distributions coming out from donor-advised funds over that period of time has increased on average by almost 18% a year. And now if we look at as of the end of 2021, there were at the time more than 1.2 million distinct donor-advised funds in the US with a total value of more than $234 billion of investment. So it's a huge component of the charitable giving landscape. And if I were to point to a central reason for why these have grown so much in popularity and continue to grow year over year, it's that uncoupling feature that I suggested at the outset, that you can take with a donor-advised fund a gift and benefit from that tax benefit at the time that you put the money into the fund, but then retain that flexibility and uncouple the timing of that charitable deduction that you get when you put the money in, with ultimately the distributions out and the decisions that you make going out. So it's distinct from what we typically think about when we think about a gift, which is, okay, I'm going to make a gift to charity. I've got to decide where it's going to go, how much I want to give. And so the dynamism of a donor-advised fund is that you can uncouple those features. And there's really nothing like that in the charitable giving landscape other than something called a private foundation. And for those that are not familiar with private foundations, these are historically charitable planning tools that were designed in a similar way with similar advantages in mind. But we'll talk a little bit more, I think, in a minute about some of the disadvantages of a private foundation in relation to donor-advised funds.
You mentioned tax deductibility and tax-free growth as benefits of a donor-advised fund. What are some of the other benefits? And how do those benefits compare to the benefits or even the drawbacks of a private foundation?
Yeah, sure. So there's the main benefits, of course, are the tax benefits and the flexibility. But there are three, I would say, distinct advantages or features that often our donors will look to when they're thinking about a donor-advised fund as a planning tool. The first is that there are no startup costs or ongoing filings or annual costs to administer and manage a donor advised fund. And that's because a donor advised fund is not its own legal entity. It's actually just a fund within a broader charitable context. So like at Notre Dame, for example. If you compare that to a private foundation, that's very different. Private foundation is its own legal entity, which means that you have to create the organization under state law. And then you've got to obtain tax exempt status by filing some initial documents with the IRS. So the first benefit is really that elimination of the startup costs and the ongoing management costs of it. The second is that it's really a privacy benefit with donor advised funds. So the balances in a donor advised fund, the grants that you make from a donor advised fund, these are not publicly disclosed information. The identity of the donors that's not publicly available information. Distinct from that in a private foundation context is that if you have a private foundation, you have to file what's called a Form 990, which is an annual filing that really is a very transparent balance sheet. It shows the grants that you've made from that foundation in the last year. It shows the value of your investments. It shows the individuals that are board members or officers with the foundation. So it's a very transparent, publicly searchable form that eliminates any desire for privacy that you might have in your charitable giving. And then the third key benefit that I would mention is that there are no annual minimum grant requirements from a donor advised fund. So that's certainly the case with Notre Dame's own platform, which we'll talk more about in a minute. That's the case also with most other donor advised fund platforms. That's distinct as well from a private foundation where by law you have to distribute at least 5% of the annual fair market value of the foundation's assets. So all of those features together, and I'll share maybe one more that's not as commonly cited but still has some value in certain circumstances, which is that we mentioned tax deductibility. There are limits on tax deductibility for charitable gifts, just generally speaking, in a given year, and that's based upon somebody's income for the year. Those limits are higher for gifts to a donor advised fund than they are to a private foundation.
Yeah, given all those benefits, I can see why it's grown so much in popularity. Now, what makes a Notre Dame DAF unique compared to other DAF options?
Yeah, so we created our own platform in 2007, and we did so within a landscape of more and more, certainly now, even back in 2007, a lot of different financial institutions are offering their own platforms, and they do a great job of that. So if we were going to do this, we needed to make sure there were distinct advantages of creating our own platform and to have a really clear rationale behind it. And so there were three at the time that really motivated Notre Dame's creation, and still, I would say today, are kind of our value proposition for our platform. The first and most commonly cited is that our donor advised funds are invested directly in Notre Dame's endowment. So for our viewers that are not familiar with Notre Dame's endowment, it has been for decades one of the highest performing endowments, certainly in higher education. If you look at institutional endowments more broadly around the world, we've been at the top nearly year over year. And the reason for that, we'll look at a slide in a moment, but just by way of background, Notre Dame invests its endowment with around 200 different investment managers around the world. We have significant exposure to private equity investments and really great relationships with our investment partners that allow us to be really nimble from an investment standpoint. Mike Donovan, our chief investment officer, and his team do an incredible job taking a long-term focus, certainly with our investment mix. We're not knee-jerk responding to fluctuations in the markets, but really strong partnerships that allow us to usually have an advantage over alternative options. And so if we take a look at a couple of charts, the first is a bar chart to show Notre Dame's investment performance by a few different periods of time. There's a 1 year shown here, a 5 year, a 10 year, and a 20 year comparison of Notre Dame's investment performance and its endowment compared to a couple of different benchmarks. When I talk about this, I typically am pointing to the far right, that 20-year investment column, because these are investments in a donor advised fund and other ways in the endowment. These are long-term investments. And so, yes, there are going to be fluctuations year over year. Certainly, we've seen that in the last couple of years, pretty dramatic swings up and down in markets more broadly. But if we look at the 20-year, we've been at almost 11% on average over the last 20 years. And I often will compare that if I'm talking to a benefactor family I'll compare that to that green bar, or excuse me, the blue bar, the bar that shows what is often a typical investment mix of 60% stocks and 40% bonds. And so over time, that nexus between what is almost 11% for Notre Dame and 6.2% for that very common comparable investment option shows the long-term advantage that we have. If we look at another slide that shows a line chart, and really the purpose of this is to show when we have that type of investment advantage, what does that mean over the long term? And so this graph here shows the value creation over that same 20-year period, starting with the same investment amount. And through that compounding of that investment performance by comparison to other options is really where you see the power of the Notre Dame endowment, certainly for something like a donor advised fund. So the first advantage certainly is that ability to invest directly into the endowment. The second is that unlike most other donor advised fund platforms, we don't assess any fees to administer the donor advised funds at Notre Dame. We don't assess any direct investment management fees to do it. The endowment return essentially is what you get when you invest in a Notre Dame donor advised fund. And so that for us has been a great advantage because at most other donor advised fund platforms, they charge anywhere from 25% to maybe more than 1% of that annual balance of the fund as a fee. And so if you eliminate that headwind, you've got the opportunity to see a higher impact and higher growth of those funds. And then the third is that if we were going to do this, we wanted to make sure that it was personal, that we knew you and your family, that we had relationships with you, so that as if any challenges arose or if questions arose with use of the donor advised fund, you had not only a dynamic online portal, which we've recently built over the last few years to go in and see the whole history of your fund, to see the balances, to see your grant history, but also a team of dedicated professionals here that are able and willing to assist and jump in. And so everything that we do with our donor advised fund, not only in the investments, but also the administrative piece is all managed in-house.
I think it's a really powerful illustration of how your money goes further with Notre Dame. Now, you mentioned that through a Notre Dame donor advised fund, benefactors can support both the university, but also other charities. Can you share more with us about the structure of the donor advised fund program and how benefactors can support multiple charities from their fund?
Yeah, to be sure. So part of the uniqueness of Notre Dame's platform is that there are typically two funds within each donor advised fund that are created. One is what we would call a retained fund. So if you think of kind of two buckets or silos, the retained fund is the piece that is Notre Dame specific. So those dollars, the donors decide when and where to ultimately distribute those dollars to Notre Dame, but they're earmarked for use at Notre Dame. And then up to 50% of the dollars can be also contributed to what we call a distributable fund. And a distributable fund can be used certainly for Notre Dame, but also can be used to support other charities that Notre Dame families support. So when a contribution is made into a donor advised fund, if we have these two side-by-side funds existing, we make those allocations on the front end. Again, at least 50% has to go into the retained fund. And then they're both invested the same way, so you're getting that same investment performance. And when we draw down one, because you're making grants from one, that doesn't affect the balance of the other. But I thought, Leanne, too, we could also take a look, if we could, at an illustration to see how a Notre Dame donor advised fund might compare to an alternative option. And so if we see on the screen here, a lot of numbers, but let me share just sort of the methodology behind an illustration like this, which we often will produce and personalize for folks that are thinking about these. So what you see here is $1 million investment into a donor advised fund, comparing that same investment with Notre Dame through its donor advised fund platform to an outside donor advised fund option. A lot of assumptions are baked in here, but the rationale that we used in putting this together was, let's assume our 20-year return and compare that to that 60-40 stock to bond investment mix over the same 20-year period. And then let's assume that a 5% distribution is made, even though that's not required. Let's assume a 5% annual distribution is being made from the fund, both at Notre Dame and from the fund external to Notre Dame. And then let's assume, again, a fee component for the outside donor advised fund, but none at Notre Dame. You'll see year over year the difference over time. And if we look at a summary slide here, you'll see ultimately the power just over a 10-year period of what the difference could mean if we assume these hypothetical performance and fee inputs. Ultimately, under this illustration, you'd have almost $150,000 more in grants from that donor advised fund over the 10-year period, and then a balance at the end of that period of about $700,000 more through the Notre Dame option, assuming these different hypothetical figures. And so just over a 10-year period, a pretty significant difference in value that, if passed as precedent, some pretty special things can happen over that period of time.
Wow. Well, let's talk more about the process of actually making charitable distributions or grants from a Notre Dame donor advised fund. How does a benefactor who has a DAF go about doing that?
Sure, it's a really simple process. So once the donor advised fund is established, and we'll talk about how you do that in a minute too, which is also very, very simple. I mentioned this online portal that we utilize, and so each benefactor that has a donor advised fund has their own personalized login, and part of that portal is a page where you can make those grant requests. And so for grants that are coming to Notre Dame that you want to make, you select that program or purpose, you input that amount, you submit that grant request, and then we process that by moving those funds directly to that cause or purpose at Notre Dame. For grants that are being made to outside charities, we have a search function that allows you to find those charities in a really simple way. And then once you submit that grant request, there's a due diligence process on our end to make sure we can make that distribution. Typically, that's about a 2-week process, unless there are questions that we may have for you or for that recipient charity. But typically 2 weeks is what we're looking at. And then what we do at the end of that due diligence process is we send a check with a cover letter to that recipient charity. Unless the donors want anonymity in that process, we would include in that cover letter the names of the donors, their mailing address for acknowledgement purposes from that charity. And then again, if a donor says that they would prefer to be anonymous, we can do it that way as well.
Well, sounds pretty simple. Now, for those watching and trying to determine if a DAF is right for them, what are some of the circumstances or situations in their life that would indicate that they should call you to learn more?
There's a few different circumstances that I would say come up quite a bit when we're talking about this, and reasons that folks are thinking about it. One is a very common reason, which is a donor advised fund is a really centralized way to manage your philanthropy. And so it cuts down, I think, on a lot of the complication that you might have when you're thinking about distributions, not just to Notre Dame, but to many other charities often as well. And so it's a centralized, simple way to have kind of a one-stop shop, both for making those gifts in order to secure your tax deductions, and then that centralized way to then go from there and make those distributions while, again, benefiting from that investment performance. So there's a broad appeal, I think, for folks just from a simplicity standpoint. I would say we also see quite a bit of folks where when we get to calendar year end, they know they need to make some charitable gifts. They want to do that from a tax planning standpoint. They're just not sure exactly where they want to go. Maybe even within Notre Dame, they don't know quite where they want to allocate that gift. So a donor advised fund can be a great landing spot for folks that are really thinking about the tax side of things in a very busy year end, often for folks, but then giving themselves that flexibility to decide on that distribution and those distributions coming out of it. A few other scenarios that come up quite a bit. If you have a spike in income in a given year, maybe there was a liquidation event or a sale of a business, or retirement is approaching and your income is expected to go down after retirement. It's always a good idea to match up as best as possible your charitable deductions with your high income years. And so again, a donor advised fund can be a great landing spot in that scenario. Two other scenarios, Leanne, that I'll share that are coming up more and more. We've talked about private foundations a little bit. Many folks who created maybe family foundations or private foundations decades ago, maybe they don't, there's a lot of folks that they're working fine with those foundations, but they don't love them. And they look at a donor advised fund option and the comparable advantages. And so on occasion, we'll have folks that say, let's just wind up that private foundation, move the balance into a Notre Dame donor advised fund, and then utilize that fund in the same way functionally that we would the foundation. Other folks love their foundations, and that's great if that serves a good family purpose. And so sometimes families will think about a donor advised fund as really an investment diversification option for that foundation. So they won't move all of their assets over from the foundation, but they'll move maybe a portion of it, and leverage the endowment that way. And then last, I would say more and more families are thinking about philanthropy from a multi-generational mindset. And a donor advised fund is a great way to informally involve your children, maybe even grandchildren, in philanthropic decisions. So it's really neat when we see a lot of families that will every year, maybe it's December, maybe it's some other time when they get together, maybe it's when they're on campus for a football game in the fall, they'll come together and they'll decide together as a family, where do we want to make our charitable gifts this year, and who do we want to support, and what at Notre Dame do we want to support? And donors can, of course, decide how much they want to involve family, but it's a great way to sort of teach philanthropy to your kids or grandkids and create that family legacy of philanthropy.
Yeah, and a nice way to bring the family together.
Yeah, to be sure.
All right, well, we've covered the basics, and now we want to make sure that we get all the questions answered that were sent prior to the webinar. First question, for those who want to get started, TJ, what are the steps for creating a DAF at Notre Dame?
It's really quite simple. The first thing to do always is have a conversation with me or a member of our gift planning team. We want to make sure that you understand the ins and outs of the donor advised fund and how it works, and make sure we have a chance to address any questions you might have. Once we've done that, we would send an email to you with a personalized online link. And so you click into that link, there's an application, takes a few minutes to complete the application. We review it, make sure there's no questions that we have, and then you're up and running. So once the fund is established, there's a minimum gift amount of $500,000 that needs to be made into the donor advised fund. Again, if we're thinking about a 50-50 split between this retained fund for use at Notre Dame and a distributable fund, you're looking at a $250,000 minimum investment at Notre Dame, and then up to $250,000 in that distributable fund. And then from there, it's completely up to the donors on how they use it. So often folks will make contributions every year, and you can do that at least $5,000 increments. There's no minimum balance that needs to be maintained in the fund once you've created it. And then grants coming out of the fund can be made at increments of $5,000 or more to recipient charities.
Your mention about the minimum amount for additions to the DAF brings us to our next question. Outside of the $5,000 minimum, are there any other limitations in use of a Notre Dame donor advised fund?
Yeah, there are some really important limitations that are some of these are unique to Notre Dame. Some are just general limitations in use of a donor advised fund anywhere. So the Notre Dame specific limitations are, a couple are related to the NCAA. So we cannot make any distributions from a donor advised fund to entities or charities that could be deemed a recruiting violation for NCAA purposes. So what does that mean? Typically, we're talking about high schools. We can't make grants to high schools. We can't make grants to community colleges. We can make grants to other four-year colleges. So a lot of people will support multiple colleges, and that's great if they want to do that. And then a more recent restriction. So folks may see a lot of activity in this name, image, and likeness space in higher ed and higher ed athletics. We cannot give money from a donor advised fund at Notre Dame to what's called an NIL collective. And so that's a new limitation that folks should be aware of. So those are the Notre Dame specific limitations. In addition to what I would say, Leanne, is a mission restriction, which is because of these are funds held at Notre Dame, we won't make distributions to charities or for charitable purposes that conflict with Notre Dame's Catholic mission. And then generally speaking, you can't make grants from a donor advised fund to a private foundation. You can go the opposite direction, as we talked about, but you can't go from a donor advised fund to a foundation. And you can't make grants from a donor advised fund for lobbying purposes, for political purposes, or to foreign organizations.
We had a question about what happens to a donor advised fund once the benefactor passes away.
Yeah, it's an important question, and one we always want to talk about at the outset. There are three different options that you have when you create a Notre Dame donor advised fund. The first is that you can elect, if you wish, to have any balance that's in a fund. Let's say it's spouses together that created a donor advised fund at Notre Dame. If there's a balance there when they have both passed away, those funds can be used as an unrestricted gift, certainly if you wish, to Notre Dame. And those are always such valuable gifts for Notre Dame. A second option is to designate with more specificity how you want those dollars to be used both at Notre Dame and for other charities. So if you have a balance in a distributable fund, you could choose to have earmarked any balance to go to those outside charities. And then third and most common is that you can designate an adult successor, typically an adult child, But if you don't have kids or you want to name somebody else, we can certainly do that. And that person, that adult successor, would have a 10-year window to make decisions about distributions in the same way that you do as a donor, a 10-year window to make those distributions and ultimately wind up the donor advised fund.
Okay. Our last question is from someone who already has a donor advised fund through another organization. Mm-hmm. The question is, can they move some or all of these assets to a Notre Dame donor advised fund?
They can, yeah. This is a common conversation topic for us. Many folks will have already created, many folks may be watching, will have created donor advised funds at other charitable entities. And so, yes, the process is, they're very easy. A grant from a third-party donor advised fund can be made to Notre Dame, and we can put that right into a Notre Dame donor advised fund, so long as we've done the legwork at the outset to create the fund itself, go through that application process, and establish that minimum requirement, either from external funds or from money coming in from that third-party donor advised fund. Often, again, folks will look at private foundations as a source of giving into a Notre Dame donor advised fund. So we're always willing to explore those options and see what makes the most sense.
Yeah, thanks, TJ. As always, we packed a lot of information this afternoon. Now, for any questions that we may go unanswered, or if anyone's interested in learning more about a donor advised fund, what should they do?
Yeah, so reach out to us. I think our information is up on the screen. Reach out to any of us. I think I've said this before, and Jessica probably shared last time. It's a great honor and privilege for us to serve as philanthropic planning partners for Notre Dame benefactors. And so we always welcome a conversation. We want to make sure that we're planning in a way that's smart and helpful for you and your family, and that's tailored to what you want to accomplish, both from a charitable planning standpoint, from a tax planning standpoint. And so there is no one-size-fits-all solution. We hope for many, and we know for many of our folks, our donor advised fund platform has been a great option, and we welcome the chance to explore it.
Yeah, great information. TJ, thank you.
Thank you.
And as we close, we invite you to view the previous segments of our Planning Your Irish Impact series, available on the Notre Dame Gift Planning website right now. Thank you, and go Irish.